name is Samantha Berg. I own Alaska Center for Acupuncture in Palmer, and today Winona asked me to share my bread recipe that is gluten-free and tastes like bread. So a lot of my clients over the years have asked me when they're trying to give up gluten and how do they live without bread. So it took me a while, but I finally found a great recipe that I love, and so I'm going to demonstrate how I make this. It looks a little bit overwhelming with all the different ingredients, but once you do it a few times, it's actually very easy and you don't have to live your life without bread anymore. So if you like toast, you can bring that back in without exposure to gluten.
And it is really good.
Yeah.
It's texturally just like bread.
Yeah.
I frequently call her and ask her to make me some.
Yeah, and you can toast it, put butter on it. You can use it as sandwich bread. So I'm going to do two different demonstrations today. This is what the bread looks like when it's done. So it's a little mini loaf, and you actually the recipe will make 2 of these little mini loaves. Or what you can do is you can make 1 loaf of bread. And if you like pizza, a lot of people once they try to go gluten-free, that's another thing they think they have to give up is pizza. And a lot of the gluten-free crust recipes out there are kind of like more like crackers.
Yeah.
So this actually makes a pizza crust that you can roll out and make something that tastes. This is the closest that I found to pizza crust. I mean, there are some really good recipes out there, but you know, if you're gonna, so you could make 1 whole recipe, get 1 loaf of bread, and then this is the other half of the dough, and it's already risen. So I'm gonna demo how you can roll this out and make pizza.
Perfect.
So if you're gonna make pizza, just let you know what you want to have. So this is, I have a pizza stone here, and if I was going to be putting this in the oven, this is obviously well used. I heat this up at, for the pizza, I actually heat it up to 500, but for the bread, I do 425.
So you heat up the stone
first?
first?
I let the stone,
Okay.
so while I'm, with the bread recipe, if I'm just gonna do bread, then once I get the dough ready, I will put the pizza stone in the oven, put it at 425 so it's ready to go after the bread rises for an hour. But if I'm gonna do pizza, I heat it up to 500.
Cast iron skillet would probably work too.
Yeah, that would probably work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a stone, you can do that. And then parchment paper is really good so that it doesn't stick to the stone. And this particular recipe calls for if you go strictly to the regular recipe, which we will include and underneath the video, it just calls for blanched almond flour and arrowroot flour. And I like to play around with my flour, so when I do it, I actually do, and I feel like I get a better texture using half blanched almond flour, and it's the fine flour, and then half of the whole almond flour.
Okay.
However, if you're lectin sensitive, it is the whole almond flour. I think it's the casing on the almonds that has people be more sensitive. So if you're sensitive to lectins and you know that's an issue for you, then just do the blanched almond flour. So I use half and half. The recipe calls for a cup of the blanched almond flour. I use half of each. And then similarly, arrowroot flour. And arrowroot is not really, it's not a grain, it's a root, so it's a ground up root, so most people aren't sensitive to that. And of course, because I'm me, I do half arrowroot and half cassava flour. Again, you could use all cassava, you could use all arrowroot, whatever you like. This is just to let you know that you can play around with the amounts and see what works for you.
And that is your binding part of the recipe. That's what keeps it.
Yeah, and actually the other thing that's in it is coconut flour, and that absorbs water. It's and there's only a 1/3 of a cup of coconut flour in there. So that I would say this I don't change, because this actually helps give you the bread texture.
And too much coconut flour, I think in any bread recipe, you feel like you're parched from the desert.
Yes,
That's what I
it absorbs water. So this part of the recipe I don't change. I found over the years of doing this that this has to stay the same, but otherwise you can mix and match.
So we've got half a cup, half a cup, half a cup, half a cup, and a third of a cup.
Okay.
Okay.
And then the other thing, if you if this is overwhelming and there's like too many bags in your house, the Namaste Flour is a pretty good combo. This one does have some brown rice flour, but I don't find that it's as gritty. It's got tapioca starch, brown rice flour. It does have some arrowroot, and then it has sorghum flour and xanthan gum. So just so you know, if you're sensitive to, some people xanthan gum doesn't work for them, but most people can handle it. So if this is too much, you could do just the almond flour and do the the Namaste Flour, and
So
Fred Meyer has that.
then you would do a cup of almond
Yeah,
flour
and
and a cup
of
and
that.
a third
Yeah.
of this one.
Yeah, so you do a cup of this, a cup of that, and then a third of that.
Oh, so you'd still keep
Yeah,
your
so
cup.
you could get rid of that if you wanted
Okay.
to. But this is just another option if you want to play around with flours. It's kind of infinitely changeable. And then the other thing that I change about the recipe, you're going to be adding, this is stable. The recipe also calls for a teaspoon of salt. I use the Redmond real salt. I think that's what you have here.
Yep.
And then I like my bread to taste a little bit more whole grain like, so I actually add some hemp hearts and some flaxseed to the bread before I let the dough rise. And this again is like a personal taste thing. You can I've done it with pumpkin seeds. If you want to make a bread that's a little bit more Italian tasting, you could even throw some different herbs and spices. So you could use like thyme and oregano and rosemary. You could put olives in there. Like, this is infinitely changeable. The one thing I will say is, because it seems to affect the yeast if you do too much of the real aromatic spices like the thyme and the oregano and stuff. So just to be aware, you might not get as good of a rise on it.
Okay.
But you could certainly do like ginger or cinnamon if you wanted to
Nice.
put that in there.
Nice.
Yeah. So at a certain point, if you put too much spices in it, it seems to get in the way of its ability to really rise, like it affects the yeast. So that's why this is sort of my base recipe. And then the other thing is, like, if you're going to use big nuts or big seeds, that's going to make it really difficult to roll out when you do pizza crust. So if you're planning on doing pizza crust, then if you just stick with the hemp hearts and the flaxseed, that works great.
Yeah.
It's easy. But once you start putting big pumpkin seeds in there and walnuts or pecans,
great for bread.
yeah, great
so
for
much
bread,
for
not so hot
pasta.
for pizza crust. So just be thinking about that. It'll just make your life a little bit easier. So okay, and then I use Bob's red mill yeast, and I have a yeast spoon. It's always bizarre to me that the yeast spoon is 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, so that's exactly the amount that you need for the recipe. So this is kind of a fun thing to have. And then the other thing that I find is helpful, I have a coffee grinder. That's what I do all my spices in. This is like, I don't know, this is an old one, but you could probably find one for $20. You can find a used one, but this is great to have for grinding spices. I'm gonna add, additionally to the recipe, I'm gonna add some ground chia and ground flax to my yeast mixture, and that's going to give it that chewy kind of bread consistency. The other thing, that's something I add to it. This is already in the recipe, and it's organic psyllium husks. It calls for 2 tablespoons of this, and additionally I add the flax and the chia to it. So again, just because I like that chewy texture for bread.
And it's a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. So it's just more healthy for you anyway.
Yeah, it just makes it healthier. And then when you get the yeast to rise, it's important to note that you really do want to use actual maple syrup or real sugar, or you do not want to use honey, because honey again is antimicrobial. Yeah. So I just have the organic maple syrup for having the yeast rise. So that's kind of important. A lot of people
think coconut sugar would work for that.
I don't think coconut sugar, and you can't use like xylitol. Won't do it.
No stevia. So you do need
so
to
this
use...
it's 2 teaspoons of maple syrup, so it's not like a lot for 2 loaves of bread.
And I like the maple syrup as opposed to using the cane sugar anyway.
Yeah. So I think that is it. Oh, and then the last thing is, you want the temperature of your water when you're adding the yeast to it. This is the one thing that you really need to get precise. Between about 110 and 105 is what the temperature of the water needs to be. So so it's nice to have a thermometer so you can measure it when it's in there. And I've got water sitting here that did boil. So what I'll end up doing is I'll put some in. I'll measure it out in here, and I'll add a little bit of cool water, and I'll just get it until right at 110, and then I will add my maple syrup and my yeast into this. I'll pour the water in here and mix it around, and then I'll watch, and you'll see that the yeast rises. If the yeast doesn't rise, start over. Because then it'll end up with 2 little rocks.
Yeah, you get bricks.
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably make okay pizza crust, but it won't make good bread.
Yeah.
So,
well, then you can dip it in your soup.
Right, true. Yeah, you can make croutons out of it. And I've never had the Bob's Red Mill yeast fail. So this is in the natural food section. Red Star yeast is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
The Fleischmann's, every once in a while with the little packets, I end up with one that it's a dud.
Yeah.
Purcell Mountain Farms, I think I've also ordered yeast from them too. But these guys are pretty consistent, and I just keep it in the fridge, you know. So I don't think I've ever had Bob's Red Mill Nut Rice.
Well, walk us through the process.
All right, here we go. Here's the process. So again, I will let you know what I'm doing according to the recipe and my little modifications, so you can follow along with me.
Do you want me to do anything? Do you want me to measure?
I think
you just go on.
Yeah, I'll just go.
I'll just be Vanna.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Big mixing bowl. Okay. Oops. I'm gonna put that down gently. Okay. So the first ingredient, you have your dry cup measure. I just put it in there because I tend to be messy. So the recipe says a cup of fine almond flour. I'm gonna do about half a cup of the fine and half a cup of the natural almond flour. And I like to go a little bit over because it's not really going to hurt if you have a little bit more bread. So I kind of go overfill in the cup.
That's the thing about baking.
Yeah.
You can always go over your adding to it.
Yeah, I'm just always adding a little bit more because I know I'm going to make a double loaf, so I want to make sure it's big enough. Okay, and then the other thing you're going to need the cup measure for, and again, I just leave that in there. The recipe says a cup of arrowroot. We're going to use half a cup of arrowroot and a half a cup of cacao. And this is very fine, so like it goes poof, and then you breathe it in and you start coughing all over the place. So just to know, be a little bit careful when you put that in. And when you mix it too, it'll kind of poof up in your face. So if you're sensitive to that kind of stuff, you know, you could wear a mask if you want. That's what good yeast for masks.
Right.
Yeah, even when I close that back, you can see the powder comes out.
You know, and the reason why these ingredients are used, again, they're gluten-free, but the brand is Bob's Red Mill is a really good brand as far as getting clean products where they're not mixing products. Sometimes that happens in different mills, and I think they're a little more careful.
Yeah, if you have somebody in your life who's gluten-free, they are actually careful about not processing stuff on the same equipment. They even have like gluten-free, they have oats that haven't been processed.
And actually, just one thing that you'll note when you're looking at foods is the little labels that are on here, like this is a non-GMO verified. To know that it's gluten-free, you're going to want to have the actual stamp gluten-free. Because this is not a flour, it's actually a root. It's not going to have gluten in it, so we know that. But when you're looking at actual grains, look for that stamp.
Yeah, and some people cannot tolerate. There's a lot of kind of old style wheats like the Kamut flour, where some people can have cross-reactivity with gluten. With rye is another one. People cross-react to. So, but none of this stuff. Anybody I know who's gluten-free can do this with no problem. So you don't have that cross-reactivity. Okay, then your coconut flour, and so it's going to be a third cup of the coconut flour. And again, I put that in there because I'm messy, and that way it doesn't get all over the counter. I pour it over. Okay, good. Okay, so those are all the flours. And then the recipe calls for a teaspoon of salt. And again, we're using the Redmond real salt, which I like because it's got a lot of trace minerals in it. And I don't know if you've said a lot about salt so far in the class, but the regular salt that you get in the supermarket is basically sodium plus chloride plus an inorganic iodine and an anti-caking agent, so it's not really salt. So it's hard for you to absorb the nutrients, and believe it or not, most people are actually salt deficient, so this is a good way to get lots of trace minerals and get real healthy salt. So that goes in there. Oops, I'm still putting down stuff hard on the counter. Okay, so salt, and then this is my little add-on. I like to add some flaxseed and some hemp heart to this.
Do we want to plug your grinding?
Oh, actually, I'm not going to grind it right now. Yeah, not yet. This is just like adding to the bread texture, and then I'm actually going to add ground to the yeast mixture. So we're gonna do, I don't know how much this is. It's probably about a tablespoon or so. You could do like 2 tablespoons of hemp hearts and 2 tablespoons of flaxseed. It just really depends what you want.
And you're doing the whole flaxseed.
Yeah, I'm doing the whole flaxseed in the bread. I'm gonna mix it all together, and then when I make the yeast mixture that gives it that chewy thing, that's when I'm gonna grind it.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, looks good. Okay. All right, now I get to say scalpel. No, hand me a mixing spoon. Scalpel. Hand me the extractor.
Yeah. Anyone?
Yeah, anything.
Yeah,
Really
here
is
we
fine.
go.
Okay, so and then here, this is where just be careful because you have all those really light flours, and invariably, even if I'm being really gentle, I get flour poofing up on my face. So when you first start mixing it, just be a little bit gentle. So, yep, I did it.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
So,
pour this over quick, so
all right,
we
great.
need it.
All right. So you just want to make sure that you got it mixed pretty well, and it'll start to almost get a little bit granular when you got the right consistency. So this way, when I add my wet ingredients to it, it's already really, really well distributed. One of the mistakes I see a lot of times is unless you're using an electric mixer and adding stuff in and it being mixed, people will get like, they'll bake something and there'll be like a clump of salt or something in it. So this is one of those things that if you just take a little bit of extra time on the front end and mix all the dry ingredients really well, then you get something that's got more consistent flavor.
So what I don't see are eggs, so we don't put eggs in this recipe.
Yeah, this is actually...
So this is a vegan bread way.
Is it vegan if there's yeast in it?
Well, that's a
Does
good
yeast
question.
count? I don't know. And it doesn't have honey, so then that would make it... But yeah, just because there's yeast in it. I guess you could do a sourdough, but if you have any kind of bacterial or yeast... We'll get back to you.
That's another class.
Yeah.
But it is a plant-based.
Yeah, it's
plant-based.
Yeah. I'd say it's pretty darn close to
And when we're thinking about anti-inflammatory, we've got a lot of good anti-inflammatory.
Okay, so you can see it's getting sort of like almost like a little granular texture, so I know it's mixed all the way through. So that looks pretty good. All right, so you can kind of see that everything's well distributed in there. So any of your nuts and seeds are not in clumps, and it's all like a nice uniform mixture. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is take this, and at first I'm not going to worry. You need, the recipe says 1.25 cups of water. I usually know that I use more, so but I'm not going to worry about measuring out the exact amount because I want to get the temperature right. So go ahead and pour in like 1 cup in there, and we'll just see where
I'll just pour this direction.
So we're going to just see how hot that water is, and then I'm going to add cold water to it. Yeah, so that's pretty hot. So we're already up over like almost 140.
So and we want it to be at
110 is what I was shooting for. So so actually I'm going to let that sit there for a sec because I'm just going to let it cool down. And then I forgot what I like to do first is just measure out the yeast and the maple syrup so you can put it right in there. So use your yeast. So while I'm fiddling around with this, I can have that all ready to go. All right, so you have your dry yeast, and that again is Bob's Red Mill. I'm gonna take my yeast spoon, and again, you don't have to be exactly, just do like an overflowing spoon, maybe a teeny little bit more, because I know I used extra. So that's 1 yeast spoon, and then about 2 teaspoons of maple syrup. And again, you know, roughly 2 teaspoons. Okay, so that's all ready to go there. Okay, great, awesome. Okay, so now I'm gonna add some cold water to that. Oh, is that cold?
Yep.
Okay, great. So then so you've got your quart jar with a mixture of maple syrup and a yeast spoon, so that was 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. I'm gonna pour that in there, and I just need a spoon to mix that around. Oh, actually, I got them. We're good. Okay, so mix it around, and then almost immediately you should start seeing a little bit of bubble action happening.
So an active yeast is one that starts to bubble and
Yeah.
it'll have
So
a foam on top of it.
So it's basically eating the sugars in the maple syrup, and then it's putting out carbon dioxide. And so that makes it right. Yeah, so you can see like little foam starting in there, so we're good. And it'll start to bubble a little bit. So it's probably gonna take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, and you'll start to see a little bit of a foam layer. And this is a good time to grind the flaxseed and the chia seed. And so we got our flax and chia. Is that plugged in?
Yep.
Okay. So, and again, this is my little addition to the recipe. What I do is, again, it's probably like a couple of tablespoons of each that I'm putting in here. I just sort of eyeball it. And you could have done this before. This is just the way I do the timing. I'm just going to dump the rest of the chia in there. And chia is super high in omega-3 and it's great fiber. Bonus info on this bread is if you have somebody in your life who tends towards constipation and you give them this bread, they will not be constipated. So it's really good for getting the bowels moving. This is a really high fiber bread.
The psyllium and
between the psyllium and the ground flax and the ground chia, like it's like a smooth move bread. Okay.
So inside the grinder, there's like a little metal cup. So she's basically filled that up to the metal cup inside of the grinder.
And then I have a little grinder rule too I'll share. So I'm going to grind this. It's a very old grinder, but it does the job. And you got to be a little bit careful when you pull it off so stuff doesn't go everywhere. So that's pretty well ground. So my number one rule for the coffee grinder is unplug it before you stick your fingers in there. And fortunately, Winona's got long arms, so she can do it. Okay, awesome, great. So yeah, that's just never reach into the coffee grinder when it's plugged in.
That's a good rule.
Yeah, that's like I always move it.
Finger.
I always move it somewhere else. So you can see this is already starting to get a little layer. I'm probably gonna have it go twice as much, but
I'm just gonna walk up to the camera and you guys can get a good view of this. So this is our yeast that is active right now. So there's a lot of activity going on inside of the glass.
You know that now again, it doesn't have to be a round pizza crust. Some people like doing square pizza. So you know, whatever shape you want it to be. First thing I do is just press it out a little bit. If you find you made your dough a little bit too wet, you can do the Arrowroot flour and you can sprinkle a little bit on there, and then that'll help it not stick to your fingers. This actually put a little bit of Arrowroot on there, and that'll make it a little bit easier and less sticky to roll it out. Just depends what you want to do. So first thing I do is kind of flatten it out a little bit. Okay. So I just get it basically into the shape that I'm looking for, and then the rest of the time is just rolling it out so to the size of whatever you're going to be using. I have not used this before, so it'll be interesting to see how this goes.
Hold it in the middle. A little bit more pressure. Okay.
And another fun fact, if you don't have a rolling pin and you do have a wine bottle, you can use a wine bottle as a rolling pin. Okay, and that's actually looking like it's just about, I'm gonna take a break here for a sec.
I'll roll for you.
Okay. All right. So Nona's going to take over the bread rolling, and I'm going to finish up with these. So you can see that That's about almost an inch of foam that already, and that wasn't even 10 minutes. So that you know that the yeast is doing really well. So you're gonna add your mixture of flax and chia and 2 tablespoons of this organic psyllium powder. So do this without making a mess. Probably not. And again, if you want to just start out with the psyllium, you can do that if you don't want it to be super high in fiber. I just like the flavor, and again, it's got more nutrients, but again, you can totally experiment with it. This recipe is actually fairly forgiving. Okay, and then we're going to do 2 tablespoons of psyllium fiber, and then you're just going to mix that together. And it's going to turn into kind of like a paste, kind of floppy, gelatinous.
Yeah,
kind of gelatinous. And it takes probably like a minute for it to turn into jello. I think that's the polysaccharides and the chia and the flax and the psyllium, and all kind of absorbs the water. So you can see it's kind of turning into something that's all not so much liquid anymore. So, yep. And then you just dump it in there, and then we're probably going to need to add some more water to this, but I start just mixing it all in, and once I get all the ingredients combined, I go, oh, okay, it needs more water. And then eventually at the very end, you're going to need it by hand. So again, at first when you're combining all this stuff in there, you just need to be a little bit gentle with it so you don't have stuff flying out of the bowl.
And Sam, when you're doing the pizza crust like this, you go real thin?
You can. It depends how you like it.
Do you like it doughy, like the thicker?
Yeah, so it's really like what you're looking for in consistency. I usually roll it out to about the size of the pizza stone, which should be a little thinner than you have it, but totally works. You're just going to need to cook it a little bit longer if it's smaller.
So one thing with the pizza dough that Sam does that we talked about is par cook. And so basically it's kind of like anytime you buy a raw dough, you're going to put it in the oven for probably 10 to 12 minutes before you make your pizza. Is that right? What you do with
Yeah, you just watch it. It could be, I'll baste it with a little bit of olive oil and put some, Kevin, my husband, likes a little bit of salt on the crust, so it's almost like a pretzel crust.
Okay.
So yeah, you could baste it with a little bit of olive oil and sprinkle a little bit of salt on the crust, and then cook it. And you just watch it. But when you partially cook it for like 5 minutes or so, maybe 10 max, then you want to put pesto on the bottom, or you want to put tomato sauce first before you put anything else on top of it. It won't get soggy that way.
Right. So a really healthy way to make a pizza while Sam's mixing that up is, you can buy the pre-made pesto. You can use pesto yourself. If you buy the pre-made pesto, you're going to have cheese in it, but I believe in your Fresh Start book there is a pesto mix in there where you're using the nut Parmesan cheese and your basil. But however you do it, you can put pesto on the crust, fill it with the vegetables that you like. Sometimes I'll just put shredded carrots, I'll put cut up bell peppers, olives. You can put meat toppings on this if you wanted, chicken, whatever you like. And then I like to use vegan cheese, but you can use cheese. But the idea of a healthier pizza is not to have a cheese pizza where it's mostly all cheese, but that it is like feta or goat cheese is nice because it has a lot of rich flavor, but you don't use a lot of it on a pizza. So that's one that I might use. Okay. But the Dia brand I like.
Oh, yeah, that's good. So you can see now I've been mixing this. I've been adding water as I go because I added more dry ingredients. So I just took some of that water and added it, and you can see it's starting to hold together now. So at that point, I'm gonna use my hands and do the last
And it smells just like bread.
Yep.
It smells really good.
Yeah. So if you have never kneaded bread before, it's kind of fun. You just really get in there, and it's just I'm just using my hands for this last part just to shape it and just make sure it feels about the right consistency. I'm trying to think what to compare it to, so you know, like it doesn't fall through your hands. It's like kind of like almost on like that Play-Doh sort of consistency, but it holds together, but it's still like a little bit wet. And if I accidentally made this too wet, it actually just rises a little bit more, so don't worry about it. If you get a little bit of wet dough, you can always add more flour to it. And especially when you're making the pizza crust, like I showed you, you can put more arrowroot. So again,
So you don't have to knead this like you have to knead normal bread.
No.
You're basically just getting the moisture into the whole thing.
Yeah, because I think with the normal bread, you're like breaking down you're starting that whole breakdown process of the wheat, so you get more of that gluten. But with this, you're simulating the gluten thing, so you really don't need it. So yeah, that's the one thing about this is you don't have to do like multiple kneads. So you just form this little ball like that, and then you put it in here, and you cover it. We cover it with a towel, and you can put it someplace warm to rise. It doesn't have to be I just wouldn't put it like on a windowsill that's really cold, but it rises in about an hour. So, and if you wanted to divide it first into the two little balls, you could do that. What I'm going to do after this rises, then I'm going to divide it, and I do that by I kind of put my fingers around it and I just pinch it in half. And then I create two balls, but really whatever you want to do with that. But this is basically, and
so once you pinch it and you have a ball, you set that ball right on there, and then it just creates this loaf. You're not putting this into a round pan.
Nope. No, I just make it. Yeah, so it's basically that. Yeah, because when I pinch it in the middle, and then I just kind of roll it back around that space, and it turns into a kind of a circle shape.
Circle.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you could put it in a baking pan if you wanted to, and make it any shape you wanted.
Sure.
Yeah. So versatile. So so that's it. Put it in there. Cover it with a towel. Put it someplace warm. Put it someplace not cold. It doesn't have to be hot.
We used to wherever we had maybe preheated the oven or something, we'd set it on the back of the oven.
Yeah, someplace where it's not going to cook, but it's
on
just
top of a fridge where you get heat from the fridge.
And so then this rises for an hour. And then I divide it into the two loaves. And again, you could get two loaves like that, or you can do one loaf and one pizza crust. And everybody in your life who wants bread back but has been avoiding bread because they've been gluten-free is going to love you. So thank you.